A blood-stained Chinese satchel, seized at 18,000 feet, handed Washington its best intelligence since Korea. Inside it were roughly 1,600 classified documents, famine numbers, troop morale, the private strife of the Chinese Communist Party, written in its own hand. The men who took it were Tibetan guerrillas, trained in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, paid, armed, and airdropped by the Central Intelligence Agency. And for years, almost no one in America knew they existed. The program had a code name, ST CIRCUS. This is the story of a secret war fought on the roof of the world. A war that lasted more than a decade. A war Washington abandoned in a single stroke of policy. And a war that ended with men throwing themselves off a mountain rather than obey the one voice they still trusted. Some of what was decided in those years has been declassified. Some of it has not. And the deepest question of all, who authorized it and what one man truly knew, has never been settled. Let us begin at the beginning. The year is 1956. The place is Calcutta, in India. Two men arrived to meet quietly with officers of the Central Intelligence Agency. They are brothers, Gyalo Thondup and Taksta Rinpoche. Their family name carries a weight almost impossible to overstate. They are the brothers of the Dalai Lama, the spiritual and political leader of Tibet. At the table, they discuss something extraordinary: armed resistance, not prayer, not diplomacy, a guerrilla war against the Chinese occupation of Tibet. And the Americans are listening. Because this is the Cold War, and Washington has decided that anywhere a communist advance can be slowed, it should be slowed. Tibet fits that map. Remote, mountainous, bordering the great communist power itself. The Central Intelligence Agency saw an opportunity. But here is the first thread to hold on to. The agency arranged this program through the Dalai Lama's brothers, not on the record, through the Dalai Lama himself. Keep that in mind, because at the very end of this story, it becomes the question that will not go away. In the eastern regions of Tibet lived a people known as the Khampa, fierce, independent, and deeply resentful of Chinese control. Their resistance was already forming on its own before the Americans ever touched it. And leading much of it was a wealthy trader. His name was Andrug Gompo Tashi. On the 16th of June, 1958, he formalized what had been scattered. He founded a guerrilla army. Its name was Chushi Gangdruk. In Tibetan, that means 4 rivers, 6 ranges, the land it was named for. Roughly 5,000 volunteers from eastern Tibet consolidated under that banner. Farmers, herders, traders, men who had never fired at a modern army in their lives. They would become the CIA's primary partner in this war. But before the army was even formally born, the agency had already moved. 1957. The Central Intelligence Agency selected a small group of Tibetans for training. They were taken far from home, to an island in the Western Pacific, Saipan. There they learned to operate radios, to transmit in code, to gather intelligence and send it back. 2 of them were given simple Western code names, Tom and Luke. Their real names were Athar Norbu and Gatsetsang Lotse. In September of 1957, an aircraft carried them over the Himalayas, and they jumped. The first CIA-trained radio team ever dropped into Tibet. 2 men, falling into the dark, onto the highest ground on Earth, carrying the beginning of a war. Remember those 2 names, Tom and Luke. Because in less than 2 years, they would find themselves at the center of one of the most desperate escapes of the entire Cold War, tracking it in real time for the President of the United States. But first, the Americans needed more men, far more than two, and they needed a place to make them. The place they chose was in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, Camp Hale. It had a history. Built during the Second World War for the 10th Mountain Division. Soldiers trained there for war in snow and altitude. It sat at roughly 10,000 feet, north of a small mining town called Leadville. It was cold, it was thin-aired, and that was exactly the point. Because Camp Hale, at 10,000 feet, was as close as America could come to the conditions of Tibet. The mountains would feel familiar to the men who came. Beginning in late 1958, Tibetans were secretly flown to Colorado. Over the following 5 years, 259 of them trained there. They learned weapons, demolitions, radios, guerrilla tactics, and then they were sent back across the world to fight. But how do you hide 259 Tibetan guerrillas in the mountains of Colorado, in an American state, with American newspapers and curious American neighbors? The answer was a lie, a carefully constructed cover story. In July of 1959, the Denver Post ran a headline, "Atom Unit Making Tests Near Leadville." The story attributed the activity in the mountains to atomic testing, to the Defense Atomic Support Agency. Anyone who saw strange movement, strange aircraft, strange security around Camp Hale now had an explanation. Atomic tests, classified, sensitive, and none of your business. It was not atomic testing. It was a foreign guerrilla army, learning to fight a communist superpower, and the American public was told to look the other way. Now return to those two radio operators, Tom and Luke. By the spring of 1959, the situation inside Tibet had reached a breaking point. In the capital, Lhasa, tension between the Tibetan population and the Chinese military had become unbearable. The fear was specific, that the Dalai Lama himself was in danger. In March of 1959, he fled. He left Lhasa in secret, moving south toward the border with India, across some of the most brutal terrain on the planet. Chinese forces behind him, mountains ahead of him, and with him, or near him, were the two CIA-trained radio men, Tom and Luke. They carried a hand-cranked radio transmitter, no batteries to fail in the cold, just muscle and a crank, and Morse pulses climbing out over the Himalayas. As the Dalai Lama fled, they tracked his flight. In real time, they sent updates to their CIA handlers, and those updates traveled further still, all the way to President Dwight Eisenhower. Consider that. The most sacred figure in Tibetan life, fleeing for his life across the mountains, and the President of the United States, following his progress. Through two men trained on a Pacific island, cranking a radio by hand in the snow, the Dalai Lama reached India. He survived. He would live in exile in a town called Dharamsala for the rest of the story you are about to hear. And the war went on without him inside Tibet. But a guerrilla war needs a base, a place to gather, to plan, to wait, and to strike. That place became a district in northern Nepal. Mustang, high, remote, pressed against the Tibetan border. From Mustang, the guerrillas could cross into Tibet, hit Chinese forces, and slip back. But in the early days, Mustang was a place of terrible suffering. Understand the situation these men were in. They had gathered in a barren, freezing district to fight a war, and the promised support did not come. Not at first. The Central Intelligence Agency did not make its first airdrop of supplies and weapons to the Mustang base until March of 1961. Think about the gap. Men gathering, waiting, in one of the harshest environments on Earth. waiting for weapons, waiting for food. Veterans of that time recount what they ate to survive. Boiled yak leather, not meat, leather, boiled until it could be chewed. This was the front line of a Cold War proxy campaign. Men starving on boiled hide, waiting for a plane that took years to come. And when the support did finally arrive, when the weapons and the radios and the training came together, these men produced something the CIA had almost given up hope of getting: hard intelligence on China. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand the problem. In the early 1960s, China was a closed door. Real, verifiable information about what was happening inside the country was almost non-existent. The Great Leap Forward, the campaign that reshaped and devastated the Chinese countryside, was unfolding behind a wall of secrecy. Western intelligence was largely guessing. And then, in October of 1961, guerrillas from the Mustang base changed that. They attacked a Chinese military convoy, a convoy of the People's Liberation Army. In the fighting, they killed an assistant commander, and they seized his satchel. This is the moment the whole story turns on. The event became known as the Blue Satchel Raid because of what was inside that bag. Not gold, not weapons. Paper. Roughly 1,600 classified documents. 29 issues of a top-secret publication. The Bulletin of Activities of the General Political Department of the People's Liberation Army. An internal Chinese military document, meant only for the eyes of the Chinese command. And it told the truth. The truth China was hiding from the world and from itself. The documents detailed famine. They detailed low troop morale, sinking under the weight of the Great Leap Forward. They detailed internal strife within the Chinese Communist Party itself. This was not analysis. This was not a guess. This was China describing its own crisis in its own words. And it had fallen into American hands, seized off a dead officer's body at high altitude by starving men who had once boiled leather to survive. The Central Intelligence Agency assessed what it had received, and its verdict was blunt. The best intelligence coup since the Korean War. Understand what that means. Not the best coup that year. Not the best from Tibet. The best since the Korean War. At a time when hard information on China was almost impossible to obtain, a blood-stained satchel had delivered it. This was, arguably, the single greatest success of the entire program. And it was produced by a war the American public did not know existed. So what did all of this cost? For years, the answer was a secret. But one document, at least, has since been made public, a declassified CIA budget memorandum, dated the 9th of January 1964, published by the State Department's Office of the Historian. It itemizes the program with cold, administrative precision. Support of 2,100 Tibetan guerrillas based in Nepal, $500,000. Subsidy to the Dalai Lama, $180,000. And a stated total program cost for that budget period, $1,735,000. Read that middle line again. Subsidy to the Dalai Lama, $180,000. Because that line opens a door into one of the most sensitive parts of this entire story. The Dalai Lama received a personal subsidy from the Central Intelligence Agency, $180,000 per year, from the late 1950s through the mid-1970s. That is a long relationship. Almost 2 decades of American intelligence money, flowing to the exiled leader of Tibet. Now, what was that money for? The record indicates he used the majority of it not for himself, but for the activities of the Tibetan government in exile, including funding foreign offices. Offices whose job was to lobby the world for support of the Tibetan cause. In other words, a diplomatic campaign, funded in part by a covert American subsidy. And this is where the threads begin to tangle. The CIA was funding a guerrilla war, and the CIA was funding the exiled leadership's diplomacy. But remember how this all began. In Calcutta, through the Dalai Lama's brothers. Not, on the record, through the Dalai Lama himself. So how much did he know? About the war, about the guns, about the men trained in Colorado and dropped into Tibet? Hold that question. We are almost to the end, and at the end, that question is all that remains. For now, understand the shape of what the Central Intelligence Agency had built. A guerrilla army, Chushi Gangdruk, 5,000 strong at its founding. A training base hidden in the Colorado Rockies, disguised as atomic testing. Radio men who tracked the Dalai Lama's escape for a president. A base in Mustang that produced the best China intelligence since Korea. And a subsidy running for nearly 20 years. By the standards of Cold War covert action, it was ambitious, sprawling, and in its early years, it worked. But covert wars do not exist in a vacuum. They exist inside the larger game of nations. And in that larger game, the ground was about to shift, violently, in one direction. For years, the entire logic of ST CIRCUS rested on one assumption: that the United States and China were enemies, that anything which weakened China served Washington. That assumption was about to collapse. The man who collapsed it was President Richard Nixon. In the early 1970s, the relationship between the United States and China began to thaw. Two powers that had regarded each other as adversaries began cautiously to talk, to open a door that had been shut for more than 2 decades. It was one of the great diplomatic pivots of the Cold War, and it was, for the Tibetan guerrillas, a death sentence. Because you cannot make peace with China, while secretly arming men to kill Chinese soldiers on Chinese-controlled soil. The two policies could not exist at the same time, so one of them had to end. In 1972, the program was abruptly abandoned, not wound down slowly, not eased to a close, abandoned. The support stopped, the money stopped. The men in Mustang, who had fought for years, who had starved on boiled leather, who had seized the satchel that stunned Washington, were, in the language of intelligence, no longer useful. They were still there, still armed, still in Mustang, still, in their own minds, at war. But the power that had raised them had walked away, and now Nepal, the country hosting them, wanted the problem gone. The guerrillas were led at this point by a man trained by the CIA, a Khampa commander named Wang Du. He and his fighters were surrounded by an impossible situation. Their sponsor had vanished. Their host had turned against them. And they were being told to lay down their arms. But they would not surrender for the Americans, and they would not surrender for the Nepalese. There was only one voice on earth they might still obey. In July of 1974, that voice spoke. From Dharamsala, in exile, the Dalai Lama recorded a message, 20 minutes long. It was sent to the remaining fighters in the mountains, and in it, he asked them to stop, to surrender their weapons to the Nepalese authorities, to end the war. Imagine being one of those men. You have given years of your life to this fight. Friends have died. You have endured hunger and cold and abandonment. You have fought for one purpose above all others, the freedom of Tibet and the safety of the man now speaking on that tape. And that man is telling you, put down your gun. For some, it was more than they could bear. Following the message, some of the guerrillas killed themselves, rather than comply, rather than live with the order to surrender. They chose to end it on their own terms. And a number of the last holdouts did not surrender at all. They made a final stand at a place called Tinker Pass, at roughly 18,000 feet, the same brutal altitude at which so much of this war had been fought, there in the thin air, against Nepalese forces. A number of them died in combat. It was the end. Not a treaty, not a victory, not a homecoming. A last stand in the snow, by men whose war had already been declared over by everyone but themselves. The commander who had led them, Wang Du, was among those who did not survive the final chapter. And so ST CIRCUS ended, a program that began in a room in Calcutta in 1956, ended on a mountain pass in 1974, with gunfire and silence. Now step back and ask the hardest question. Was any of it worth it? The man best placed to answer is the Dalai Lama himself. Years later, in his autobiography, he wrote about the guerrilla mission. His words were unsparing. He wrote that it caused, in his own phrase, almost more harm to the Tibetans than the Chinese. Sit with that. The leader in whose name much of this war was fought. Looking back, judging that the resistance may have hurt his people more than the occupation it opposed. That is not the verdict of an enemy. That is the verdict of the man at the center of it all. And it forces us back to the question this story has circled from the very beginning. What did he know? Remember how it started. Not with him. With his brothers. Gyalo Thondup and Takster Rinpoche in Calcutta meeting the CIA. The agency arranged the program through them, through the brothers. His personal subsidy is documented. $180,000 a year for nearly 2 decades. But a subsidy for diplomacy is not the same as command of a guerrilla war. And here the record goes quiet. The full scope of what the Dalai Lama personally knew about ST CIRCUS, and when he knew it, remains disputed. His level of direct authorization has never been definitively documented. Did he approve the airdrops? Did he approve the raids? Did he know the men in Colorado were his men, trained to kill in his name? Or did the agency deliberately keep the sacred figure at arm's length, working through the brothers, so that the leader himself could remain, on paper, apart from the guns? The declassified record does not close that gap, and it is not the only thing that remains hidden. The Central Intelligence Agency's own internal retrospective assessment of the program, its own honest accounting of what ST CIRCUS achieved, and what it cost, has not been fully declassified. One known internal agency document exists, undated, and in the version available in declassified releases, it breaks off, before its conclusion, the agency's final judgment on its own secret war. Cut short on the page, the ending still withheld. And there is a third silence, the money. We know the yearly figure, $180,000. We know the rough span, late 1950s through the mid-1970s, but the total amount paid to the Dalai Lama over the full life of that subsidy has never been confirmed in a single authoritative declassified source. The full sum of America's investment in that one relationship remains, to this day, uncounted in the open record. So this is where the file closes. A program named ST CIRCUS that trained 259 Tibetans in the Colorado Rockies, behind a false story of atomic tests, that tracked a spiritual leader's escape for a president, that produced from a blood-stained satchel at high altitude. The best intelligence on China since the Korean War. And that was abandoned in an instant. When the map of the Cold War was redrawn, the men who fought it are gone. The mountain pass where the last of them made their stand is silent. And 3 questions remain unanswered in the declassified dark. What the Dalai Lama truly knew, and when. What the agency's own final verdict said before the page cut off, and how much, in the end, it all cost. Those answers are still classified, or still disputed, or simply never written down. And until they surface, the full truth of the secret war on the roof of the world stays where it has always been, out of reach, at 18,000 feet.